So our next speaker is Dr. Ifesinachi Okafor Yarwood. Ife, if I may, is a lecturer in sustainable development from the St Andrews University in Scotland. It's actually my own hometown, so it's nice to have someone from there. She's in the sustainable, a lecturer in sustainable development in the School of Geography and Sustainable Development. Some of you may have met Ife last year. She's been part of Catfish right from the outset, and I follow Ife on Twitter, and I'm really excited to see what she's always up to, doing her field work in various parts of West Africa and beyond. She's got a wonderfully interdisciplinary approach to tackling this problem. She looks at it from all sorts of different angles, which is exactly what the Catfish Project is trying to do. So she's going to talk to us today, particularly on the role of distant water fleets and, as she puts it, party to the plunder, distant water fishing fleets and the overexploitation of Africa's fish stocks. Please, Ife.
Good morning, everyone, and it's really nice to be here. And I'm not really sure how I'm going to beat Catherine's presentation, because really I learned so much. And I mean, there are elements of some of the things that I talk about that Catherine have already discussed or touched on. So hopefully that gives me an opportunity to just not talk about it at all. So today I'll be talking about party to the plunder, distant water fishing fleets, and the overexploitation of Africa's fish stock. And I hope that by the end of my talk, you get a sense of why it's not necessarily just about the fish. And, you know, in the spirit of the discussion around, towards the end of your presentation, Catherine, and the discussions we had about the humanity, there are actually people behind some of these numbers. There are actually people that rely on fish for livelihoods, whose livelihoods are affected, which more or less helps us to see the urgency of ensuring sustainability and ensuring that their livelihoods are somehow sustained. And so the outline of my presentation or my talk includes an introduction, which gives us an opportunity to understand why this topic is important. And then I will explore who the main actors in Africa's fisheries are, the industrial vessels, shining a light on them and how they contribute to overexploitation on the continent, with a lot of the examples coming from West Africa, Central Africa as well. And also look at the impact of unsustainable practices by the industrial vessels or industrial sector, again, shining a light on them, because I feel, and based on the evidence that I will share, that they are contributing a lot in exacerbating depletion on the continent. And then we'll look at government and international partners' response, what they are doing to stem the tides of some of the issues I'm going to talk about. And then what can be done differently. And finally, I will conclude. So to begin, why is fish important? Why are we even talking about this topic in the first place? Fish contributes to the food and economic security of millions of people on the African continent. Primarily, up to 200 million Africans depend on fish for their animal protein and by extension, their food security. And depending on where you live, fisheries contribute, or should I say, fish contribute up to 80% of the animal protein consumed in coastal communities, and sometimes actually the only source or primary source of animal protein consumed by different people. And it therefore means that if it's not there, practically the source of protein for these people is no longer going to be there if we do not sustain it. And according to the World Bank, in terms of the economic contribution of fisheries, it contributes an estimated $24 billion to African economy each year. Of course, the figure could be more, but if we're not collecting accurate data, and if there is no transparency in the system or in the sector, we might not necessarily know the exact contribution in terms of economic value. And I have obviously used this pie chart, and if you have had a look at my contribution to the chapters last year, you will see that we also try to show how fish is described as a chain empowerment scheme. And I'm saying this again because this was a response by one of the fisher folk that I spoke to in the Niger Delta, Bonny Island, and I try to understand the importance of fishing and why he's still trying when he says that they're not actually catching enough fish due to, of course, the operations of the oil sector and other things that is happening in the area. And he said that basically fishing is a chain empowerment scheme wherein it is not just about the fisher, but the fisher is able to get fish and then empower the next person, the woman that unloads or the man or the boy that is employed as an offloader, and the processors and the distributors and the traders and the fishmongers. Again, it therefore means that if anything disrupts this chain, it's not just about the fisher, other people are also going to be affected. And so in the spirit of talking about this chain empowerment, according to a blog by the World Bank, for every fisherman job in Guinea, an additional 3.5 job is created on shore. Again, it therefore means if anything disrupts the continuum of this chain, we're not going to have this 3.5 jobs. So I'm trying to sort of explain further so you get the bigger picture when we get to the so what, or why is this actually important. And then in terms of the number of people that are employed in the fisheries sector, primarily in the artisanal fisheries sector or by the artisanal fisheries sector, an estimated 10 to 19 million Africans rely on fish as a primary source of livelihood, and 19 million as a part of a diversified livelihood. Again, this figure can be an estimate because then if there are other statistics that have noted that 9 million West Africans are employed directly or indirectly by fishing. But then a recent data from 2018 by World Fish noted that in Nigeria alone, this is a population of over 200 million people. In Nigeria alone, 8.6 million people rely directly on fishing, with an additional 19.6 million indirectly, 70% of whom are women. Of course, they're not fishing directly, but they are employed or relying on fisheries as a part of livelihood, either through the value chain, processors, traders, distributors, unloaders. And so the reason why I'm emphasizing these stats and also emphasizing that it might not necessarily be up to date is to show you the variation. Of course, for you to understand that the variation might mean that data needs to be updated, or maybe it has been a while since the statistics have been collated. And also highlighting the contribution of women in fisheries, because it's of course highly gendered, wherein men dominate the fishing activity itself and women are in the post-production sector. An estimated 80% of the seafood we have in the markets in West Africa is marketed by women. So again, in the spirit of talking about the importance of fishers, you can also see the importance of women in the fisheries sector, because without them, we are practically not going to have access to the food that we were able to cook at home. And then looking at it from the perspective of West African countries, primarily countries in the fisheries advisory bodies area, such as FCWC, which is Fisheries Commission for West Central Gulf of Guinea. We have 6 countries within this region, which includes Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin Republic, and Nigeria. And their statistics knows that fisheries support directly the livelihoods of 20 million people from these countries. 80% of fish stock in the region is marketed by women from these 6 countries, and 70%, or should I say, 70% of the fish produced by these countries is by the artisanal fisheries sector. Again, sort of shining a light and trying to show the difference between the contributions of the artisanal sector, or small-scale fisheries sector, and the industrial sectors. And then fish also contribute up to 80% of animal protein, and the per capita consumption of fish in these countries is between 10 to 25 kilograms, sorry. And so we have talked about the importance of fish. However, to be able to sustain this, lovely contributions and this good picture that we have painted in terms of the contribution that these countries and their people generate from fish, the continuation is essentially threatened by depletion. And there are so many factors contributing to depletion. The impact of climate change, for example, the impact of offshore oil expansion, or should I say extension of the blue economy sector, expansion of port infrastructure, ideas around marine or ocean conservation, wherein even there are ideas around creating marine protected areas. And of course, all these things is somehow directly or indirectly affecting the ability of fisher folk to be able to make ends meet, because for every industry that is able to expand within the sea means that traditional fishing grounds are being lost. But primarily looking at depletion itself and how it is impacting fisheries, I want to shine a light on fishing activities itself, overfishing, and also briefly on the contribution of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. This statistics is actually from 2012, and it was first cited by the former president of the African Union, Madam Zuma, and she noted in trying to sort of speak about the urgency of addressing threats to fishery sustainability on the African continent. She said in the last 50 years or 5 decades that the continent have lost 200 billion to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Of course, this figure is conservative, or could be conservative, because the clandestine nature of a threat makes it practically impossible for us to put an amount to it. So it's possible that this is more, or it's also possible that it's less. And also 6 West African countries, and this is based on a publication by Dumbuya et al., of which Dihia, who is in the room, also contributed to. They lose an estimated $2.3 billion each year due to IUU fishing. And on the African continent as a whole, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing represents or amounts, or can I say, is equivalent to 45% of the legally reported catch. So this is the extent of it. And then in West Africa, it represents 40 to 65%, 44% in Central Africa, 47% in Northern Africa, and 32% in Eastern Africa. But importantly, we have talked about the artisanal fishers, the contribution they make in fisheries production and food security and economic security of the people. Because of the extent of the depletion on the continent in the last decade, the revenue generated by canoes in West Africa alone have reduced by 40%. And so this is significant, especially if you also take into account other things that's been happening across the globe. And so this is basically why this topic is important. So who are the main players in African fisheries? We have a small scale or artisanal sector, of which an estimated 85% of the African marine fisheries is harvested by this sector. And in West Africa, specifically the FCWC state, there are about 200,000 canoes operating in these 6 FCWC states. And then at the industrial level, which we're going to talk about, which is dominated mainly by distant water fishing vessels that are either linked to countries outside the continent, that are either linked to companies or countries outside the continent through beneficial ownership or through joint partnership or through licensing or through flagging regime that allows them to be on the continent to be able to exploit fisheries. So in the FCWC as of 2021, there were about 523 industrial and semi-industrial vessels operating or licensed to operate in that region. And as a whole, an estimated 25% of all marine catches are by non-African countries, representing $0.4 billion. This amount pales into insignificance, especially when we take into account that this is the amount that represents the license fees that they pay that allow them to practically, in some cases, fish until they drop. And according to this research by the FAO, the continent could actually earn an estimated $3.3 billion if they were extracting these resources themselves. And so you can see from that image, it represents basically the maritime sector, should I say the blue economy on the continent, and then it represents the contribution, with the one on green showing the artisanal sector and how they're contributing and feeding back to the continent, and then the one on the red shows exactly, and this is practically how it works. The distant water fleets, majority of what they catch, of course, goes out, including the catch, including the benefit. And so it doesn't necessarily contribute to the sustainable development and the sustainable food security of countries on the continent. And so how are they contributing to overexploitation? And of course, a lot of the statistics or some of the data that I'll be using here, I don't know if, okay, no, I think they haven't presented yet. So I would try not to go into deep so they can shine more light. I can see Duncan here already, so that's good. So how do they contribute to overexploitation? They contribute to overexploitation through transshipment. And although I'm going to talk about illegal fishing because I've already talked about the economic implication, I'd like us to know that it's not really about illegal fishing, because I feel that for so long we have talked about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing that companies and countries are actually becoming more creative and legitimizing or legalizing their once illegal activities. And they are doing that either through flag of convenience or flag of non-compliance. You know, so a country might be implicated for illegal fishing this year, and next day they are doing the same thing, but legally, because they are flying a flag of a state that do not actually have the capacity to monitor what they are doing. And so here, overexploitation could be through transshipment at sea, which can facilitate the laundering of illegally caught fish, which can also facilitate other crimes. And this is something that's interesting about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or should I say associated fisheries crime, illegal oil bunkering, human rights, arms, and drugs trafficking. Interesting point I'd like to make at this point is that according to the FAO, IUU fishing is the third most lucrative illicit crime in the world after drugs trafficking and arms trafficking. But the thing that's actually interesting about this is that fishing vessels are often used to traffic drugs and traffic arms. And even recently in the Gulf of Guinea in June, a fishing vessel from Brazil was captured doing a French operation, a maritime operation in the region. And also a fishing vessel from Brazil was also captured with drugs in April in Cabo Verde. So again, even the top two illicit or worst illicit crimes in the world are sometimes often linked to fishing. So this is why this topic is even worth studying and understanding due to the implication they might have on peace and security of states. And so the second way they contribute to overexploitation is through the abuse of vessel registries, which facilitate illegal activities. And this is made worse due to lack of transparency in a lot of countries, especially those on the African continent. And this transparency is basically a case of maybe could be created by bureaucracy or maybe lack of confidence in what they are doing, that they are not actually able to share more information or shed more light. It could be they're not doing anything illegitimate, or the system might not necessarily be corrupt, depending on which country you're looking at, but it's just that they're not sharing information. And with not sharing information, so many people are able to get away with things. And they're also able to do this through flag of convenience, wherein vessels take advantage of countries, for instance, so many countries, and I could name for now, due to the examples we have, countries like Cameroon, countries like Sierra Leone, wherein there are even countries like Gambia and Senegal, wherein there are limitations in a lot of these countries around monitoring the activities of vessels that they're able to license, but they also need the money. And so it might be illegal if we look at the way they have gone through this process, or the nature of the vessel itself, or the nature of the operation. And I would provide some example in the next slide, but these are just some of the ways wherein they use open vessel registry to fish in waters under the national jurisdiction of coastal or select coastal states on the African continent, such as the ones I've listed. And of course, Liberia is at the top that operates open registry, once operated, but they're actually doing better now. And I could say that this is one of the testament of the reasons why it is important to shine a light on some of these issues, because once you shine a light on it, it actually also helps countries to want to do something different or learn on how or what they can do differently. It also helps with domesticating their vessels by flagging them into National Vessels Registry and gaining rights as the local owner, which a lot of the times, of course, the countries they're actually operating in do not have their own national vessels. And this is also a way for them to earn income or increase their GDP. Licensing abuse, such as fishing with fraudulent licenses, is also something that unfortunately contributes to overexploitation. So already the fisheries department or the fisheries agencies are either overworked, understaffed, or do not have, or can I say, have limited capacity to work or do their job effectively, which is why things like fraudulent licenses is able to get through. People could be actually fishing or operating based on photocopies of licenses that was bought years ago and nobody would find out or nobody would know. There's also collusion with the artisanal sector through illegal transshipment, which is, again, when we talk about it on even on papers or when we read reports or when we're in spaces like this, we talk about illegal transshipment in countries like Ghana because of the extensive nature of things like cycle. But the interesting thing about it is that transshipment is also a major problem in countries like Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and is actually also linked potentially to piracy because there's this understanding that the pirates know that you have money, which is why fishing vessels are sometimes targeted. But we talk so much about Ghana, but I thought it's also important for us to highlight that it is something, unfortunately, this collusion with the artisanal sector is something that is equally happening in other countries in West Africa. And then there's fishing under multiple names, which doesn't make sense, right? And so these are some of the examples based on a piece, an article published by Ian Rowby last year. So you have a vessel, maybe one vessel that have legitimate license, but then you have 3 other vessels that are also at sea fishing with the same name. And so we've already talked about officials or the limitations in the capacity of certain states and their ability to monitor what goes on at sea. And now, without really being versed in terms of the nature and what vessels and companies would go through to engage in their illegal activities or engage in overexploitation, they would never know. So they might see full Hayum 555 and then see it again somewhere else, and they will never think that it's actually possible that vessels or companies can go through this length. And so these are some of the examples of vessels that had multiple names, at least based on this research and the data that were used to extract the information. But now I'd like to focus on flag of convenience or flag of non-compliance and beneficial ownership, because this is also another way that vessels are able to circumvent laws or sort of play the system to make their illegal activity seem legal, especially running from a country where there have been improvement in capacity, improvement in governance, improvement in laws to ensure that they are captured when they are doing anything wrong. And so they find a way to evade the system by going to other countries that are willing to license them, for example, but also have limited capacity to actually keep an eye on what they're doing. And so this is based on research by Copeland. I don't know how to pronounce your company, so I'm sticking to the publishers. Okay, yeah. All right, by TMT earlier this year. Earlier this year. And in that publication, they noted that 9 out of the 42 flag of convenience states on the African continent, this includes Cameroon, Comoros, Equatorial Guinea, Liberia, Mauritius, Sao Tome and Principe, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, and Togo. And looking at it from the European perspective, and this is also very interesting because of the fact that, I mean, at least this is my description, that the European vessels, or should I say the EU, are more like the moral police when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about fishery sustainability. And I call them the moral police because they actually have systems in place. They have the carding system, for example. They have the common fisheries policy. They have systems to ensure that vessels that are doing something wrong, at least, or countries that are seen not to be doing something to ensure sustainability, are held to account. And with the carding system, they can issue you a yellow card, which is a warning. If you do not improve your system, you will not be able to export your product to the EU, or they can give you a red card, which means you can no longer import or export things to the EU. And they also actually funding a lot of projects in a lot of countries on the West, on the African continent, including Western and Central Africa, to help them improve fisheries governance. And therefore, it becomes then problematic when you also then see them or their vessels engaging in the things that they know to be wrong. And it makes it really challenging, especially when some of the countries we talk about have this limited capacity. And then you have on the other side countries that have really high capacity in terms of their knowledge, the assets they have, and yet they are not doing something from that end, at least from the perspective of this researcher standing here, to hold those vessels accountable, at least support those countries with limited capacity to hold them accountable. And so I'll take you briefly through this journey. I don't even know if I have to go into details, if you would have access to the PowerPoint later. So catches from EU fleets reduced on the African continent from 3 to 0.5 million tons between 1990 to 2017. And this is obviously happening if you count the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is Europe, right? It's not the EU at this point. And so then gradually later, 1980s to 2007, we then see vessels of catch from EU countries such as those like Spain, France, and Italy reducing by over 70%. But at the same time, something was happening. These same vessels or their fleets that were flagged within the countries that I've just listed were going elsewhere in the Caribbean to sort of flag and then come back to them be licensed. And so when the second point reduced, we were seeing an increase in the third PowerPoint. So EU vessels or EU member states were then going to the Caribbeans to flag their vessels and then come back to be able to fish. So even though there's a reduction somewhere explicitly with vessels linked directly to the EU, we're seeing an increase when those vessels have gone elsewhere to flag themselves and so coming back. And recently, there's also an investigative research by Associated Press. They found that 14 vessels from the European Union were flagged in Cameroon, and they flag hop basically. So I have talked about how the system works, but hopefully when we listen to, I don't know if that's something that TMT and co will cover, but hopefully when we listen to them, they might shine a light about their research. But they found that countries like Belgium, Malta, Latvia, Cyprus were implicated in that particular research in terms of how they are flag hopping to engage in illegal activities, but also the flag hopping itself to be able to evade some of the provisions within the EU laws. And so how also are they contributing to overexploitation through beneficial ownership? This is the Asian example, but of course, I also want to show a caveat that even though there are so many research that sort of show that beneficial ownership in itself is not illegal, and so this is why the focus is not necessarily on IU fishing alone, but how something that seems legal can also be illegal. Beneficial ownership stems from the fact that maybe someone owns the company in Ghana, but then the actual owner, or maybe, okay, let me rephrase. I am fronted as the owner of this company because in Ghana, in a country like Ghana, for instance, only citizens can own industrial vessels or operate industrial vessels. But then in practice, the owner of the vessel, the secret financier, the person that actually benefit is somewhere in China, or the company is somewhere in China. It's somewhere in South Korea. And this is actually the reality in Ghana. 90%, estimated 90% of the industrial sector is allegedly owned, allegedly, because when you engage with those in the Fisheries Commission, the evidence they produce through the licensing is they are Ghanaians. So legally, there's actually no evidence for us to say that they are linked, but research, and they haven't also refuted it, but the documentation that is presented shows that they are Ghanaians, hence they are licensed. And so a lot of the beneficial ownership in relation to fisheries in Ghana is linked to Asian companies and countries, primarily China and South Korea. But also there's also research that has shown, again, by TMT and A.N. Raubi, they noted that a lot of the beneficial ownership is linked to nationals from and companies in China, Taiwan, South Korea, Thailand, and then in Europe, we have Russia, Spain, France, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Turkey. And so these are just some of the examples. I've also talked about the 90% ownership. And in relation to another research by Raubi, they talked about Banofi vessels. And I'm specifying this vessel because it is linked to a South Korean owner. And I feel it's appropriate given that, of course, this research is partly funded by the Korean government. And again, what they are doing is not illegal, but it talks about the beneficial ownership, wherein it's illegal if you look at the constitution, but the fact that in the end, the benefit accrued goes to a company that is elsewhere means that actually the contribution of fisheries in that country by those vessels does not necessarily go to the Ghanaian people. And then the potential link to IU fishing also implicates a lot of these vessels that are either linked to beneficial ownership to IU fishing, which is of course not the exact focus of this presentation, but basically trying to show how the activities of industrial vessels in general contribute to overexploitation, both legally and illegally, of fishes on the continent. This is actually one of the areas I wasn't going to talk so much about because Catherine have talked about how subsidies is actually allowing this to happen. And so how is subsidies by distant water fishing nations to their vessels contributing or allowing their vessels to be able to exploit to an unsustainable level the fish stock on the continent? So I give a few examples. This is based on a research by Oceana last year. They noted that in Somalia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Namibia, and Guinea-Bissau, distant water fleets benefit from 17%, 27%, 35%, 41%, and 42% respectively of the total value of the catch in the form of fisheries subsidies, of which without the subsidy, it would be practically unprofitable for them to do that. So just for you to see how subsidies also contributing to overexploitation. So if they don't get these subsidies from their government, for instance, it would be pointless by the time they've filled, by the time they've manned or woman, like the people that are going to be in the vessel that are going to help them with the exploitation. By the time they complete the expenses, it becomes unprofitable for them to be there in the first place. And so this, I felt, was a good way to show why and how subsidies is contributing to overexploitation, without even talking about the link to vessels that have received subsidies and their illegal activities on the continent. So what are their impact? The impact of this basically is that it exacerbates depletion. We've already talked briefly about the things that contribute to depletion. It worsens efforts to improve fisheries governance. It undermines food and economic security of the people, the millions of people that rely on fisheries that do not actually, by the way, get benefit. If they can't catch enough fish, it's not like they get some benefit from the government to, oh, this would hold you until you can catch enough. They are basically on their own. If you cannot catch, you cannot eat, and that's how it is. It potentially undermines peace and security. Not even potentially, it does undermine peace and security on the continent because of what these people then go on to do. And I don't want to go into details, but I just want to share an example from a country like Sao Tome and Principe. I was in Sao Tome in July to early August, and as a small island nation, population of 200,000, they are surrounded by the ocean. You would think never would depletion be a problem because practically they rely on fish and then farming sometimes. There's always going to be fish. They are surrounded by a vast body of water, right? This was what I thought, even as a researcher. But then when I got there, I went to different villages, I went to different islands, and it was amazing. It wasn't even amazing, it was surprising and also upsetting to hear that they do not catch enough fish. The artisanal fishers, they have to sometimes go 50 nautical miles to fish to be able to catch enough. And in the process, because they do not have compass, they go missing. They die because industrial vessels ram into them. We get a lot of alert of suspected sighting, especially in relation to piracy, because vessels or shipping vessels sight them and automatically assume, oh, potential pirate ship, and then you get an alert sent to different vessels to be on alert because there's this boat. But actually, these are fishers that cannot catch anything. 1 to 12 nautical miles that is actually stated for them, that reserved for them to fish, they are not catching enough. They are having to go to up to 50 nautical miles and sometimes into other countries' waters to catch enough fish, and sometimes they don't make it back home. In each community, at least the ones I visited, there is either 2 or 4 people missing that have gone out fishing and have not returned, either because, well, without a compass, they don't know how to come back. And this is also where it's also seen increasingly in terms of potential for conflict between countries, because artisanal fishers are now encroaching the waters of other countries to fish because they're not catching enough fish, and the law enforcement are being more forceful and either being abusive. And unless something is done about this, this might actually undermine the diplomatic relationship between countries across the African continent, unless actually they address this problem. And finally, cast doubt on the ability to attain SDG 14, which is basically aimed at ensuring sustainable fisheries. So what are government and international partners doing about it? What are they doing about it? So there is a lot that government on the continent are already doing. So I've talked briefly about the EU carding system, and currently countries on the continent, countries like Ghana, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Cameroon have yellow card. This is the second time that Ghana have been issued with a yellow card, which represents a warning. You need to clean up your acts, or we're going to ban you from exporting your product to our country. But also what is interesting about all these things is also that EU vessels have been implicated for IU fishing or IU related activity in a country like Sierra Leone. And in Cameroon, I've already given an example of how they are using flag of convenience to fish in those countries. And so it's also something that is worth highlighting. EU countries are also fining their own vessels that are implicated for IU fishing. But one thing that's interesting, and this is why I have highlighted it here, although a country like Spain have up to, or can fine up to 600,000 as part of their administrative fine system, in practice, this is actually an example of some of the fines that they've given. 200 euros by countries like Cyprus, Lithuania, and Estonia, and 7,000 euros for Spain, which pale into insignificance if you look at potentially the benefit accrued from some of the activities for IU fishing, which is basically is a low risk and high reward crime, which is why, especially when vessels knowingly break the law to engage in such activity, means that there is something bigger for them. Therefore, if you're fining them this amount, it doesn't disincentivize them to not engage in crime. And then China is actually canceling subsidies for vessels or companies that's been implicated for IU fishing. And there's an example of that happening in 2018 in West Africa, where 3 vessels from a particular company, 3 companies where their subsidies were canceled. And in the West African region, there's a lot of cooperation, especially, and how countries on the continent in general are trying to align themselves with international provisions. So, for example, 26 of the 38 countries on the continent have ratified or signed the post-state agreement. I mean, it's one thing to sign and another thing to implement, but the fact that they have either ratified or signed means that they are willing to at least learn from that system. And then ECOWAS, which is Economic Community of West African States, have signed a memorandum of understanding with regional advisory bodies like FCWC and SRFC. FCWC headquarters is based in Ghana, SRFC is based in Senegal. So they've signed an MOU on cooperating to improve fisheries governance, which is very important because of the nature of fisheries, should I say, the transboundary nature of it. There's also improvement in MCS through the use of technology, and this is absolutely working effectively. We are able to share data with you. We're actually able to tell you that this vessel have been implicated, this country have been implicated thanks to technology. Before, it was not possible for a lot of the countries on the continent. You could say, oh, they are sea blind. We know this is happening, but we can't actually tell you who is doing it. But thanks to technology, they can actually also tell you, and also with the help and support of external actors. They're also introducing and implementing fishing ban for artisanal and industrial sector. Regardless of how some of this action is, a lot of the times, due to the proximity of the artisanal sector, we have seen that the action have actually almost always targeted the sector that is more visible, the artisanal, because of their proximity to law enforcement, in comparison to the industrial sectors that are actually contributing to a very vast extent to overexploitation and through illegal activities and other activities. But this is purely due to lack of infrastructure, should I say, limited infrastructure. Because as I was told by some of the people that I spoke to, in different countries I visited, but most recently my trip to Sao Tome and Principe, they talked about how technology have really helped them, how technology is really helping them. They can see vessels, they can collect data on piracy, they can send a lot, but they cannot go. So basically now you can see, but you can't go to verify. You can see, but you cannot interdict. And that remains the biggest issue. And unfortunately, in terms of fisheries, the artisanal sectors are becoming the victims. They can see, the law enforcement can see them, and because of the close proximity they have with law enforcement, the law enforcement can also go and catch them or stop them, even though sometimes they're just going about their business. But then for the industrial vessels that mostly contributing to the plunder, they can see them, but they can't go there to do anything about it, which remains a challenge. So improvement in MCS have resulted in some progress. In 2019, for example, through the operation between the US law enforcement and Cote d'Ivoire, they were able to intercept 45 vessels. Out of the 64 vessels that they saw, fishing vessels, at that time, at the time of the exercise, 45 of them were engaging in one element or the other of IUU fishing, which is a lot. So imagine what happens if they are not there. And a lot of the time, they're actually not at sea because they do not have the capacity to be at sea. And then Hey You Fei 11 is another example of what technology can do, and also inter-agency cooperation and collaboration. It resulted in capturing of pirates that actually captured crew members. But also at the same time, after investigation, Nigeria was able to see that Hey Yunfeng had been coming in and out of its EEZ where it had no business to being, and also had been switching off its AIS, and it was able to also find it. And this happened thanks to technology. And recently, thanks to technology, Guinea-Conakry, and they actually use Yaris. This is a technology by Yaoundé Architecture that is supported by the European Union through Expertise France. They were able to use Yaris to see this vessel fishing in an area at a time where there was a ban and they didn't have any business being there. So this is just some examples, and there are so many other examples. But like I said before, if you can see but you can't interdict, it remains a problem, which is why at the core of the solution is cooperation and collaboration. The transboundary nature of fishing itself and the transboundary nature of most of maritime activities, and the fact that a lot of the countries on the continent, and this is the reality, have limited capacity, means that through cooperation and collaboration, it can actually offer them a way out in terms of being able to see and then interdict and then prosecute vessels that might have been implicated for doing something wrong. We have seen this work in case of piracy. They're not necessarily there, but there is a lot of evidence and so many testimonies to share in terms of how cooperation between states and joint operation is leading to success stories. There's also a need for transparency. I mean, all this conversation we're having, transparency is at the core. If countries on the continent and fishing bodies are not transparent, willing to share information on what their licensing fee is, who they're licensing, and then countries that might be housing these companies where the beneficial owners are from, if they are not also transparent or willing to share information on who these people are, willing to share information on who is receiving subsidy, willing to share information on different things, we might never actually get to the point where we can have sustainable fishing. We might be having catfish. Actually, we might be having catfish for another 50 years to discuss the same issue, and I hope this is not the case. I've talked about technology helping, but then at the same time, there's a need for synergy in the use of existing technology. There's a need for funding. There's a need for training, because a lot of the times, and this is sadly the truth, you see something with the use of technology, but you cannot interpret it because you do not have the requisite knowledge to interpret. And this is like the current limitation for so many countries. on the continent, or primarily those in West and Central Africa that I'm familiar with, that are actually using different technology to address threats to safety and security at sea. And at the heart of this cooperation and collaboration is the need for continents to work together. And I feel that increasingly, and hopefully this is actually my concluding thought, so many countries are interested in exploiting the resources in their maritime domain, especially since we started talking about blue economy and, you know, this vision of oil exploration, mining the seabed, and this is likely to increase the potential for conflict. And the fact that there's a lot of undelineated or undemarcated in the basic speak maritime boundaries on the continent means that so many countries might very soon be interested in delineating their boundaries, and this might cause conflict. Currently, we have countries like Guinea and Sierra Leone really having, I would say, mild conflict over their maritime boundaries, and this is actually resulted in certain vessels taking advantage of these disputes to do things that they should not be doing. And so I believe personally that for cooperation and collaboration to be at the core of sustainably solving not only addressing the issue of overfishing, illegal fishing, and every other thing that is contributing to depletion on the continent, there's a need for the countries on the continent to be willing to cooperate and collaborate. And that would only happen if they are also willing to share responsibilities, especially when it comes to the question of their maritime boundaries, rather than allowing it to affect their ability to cooperate. So criminal-minded actors will always find creative ways to circumvent the laws, and it is happening. However, with the use of technology grounded in improved human capacity, cooperation and collaboration by coastal states and their international partners, existing loopholes can be closed, ensuring that those that falter the laws are captured and prosecuted, which will deter them from plundering the seas. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ife. A very insightful presentation there into the situation in West Africa. We have 5-10 minutes for questions, so if anyone would like to offer their thoughts on this, or comments or questions too. I think Brice again from the IMO.
Well, thank you. Congratulations. It was very interesting, and also just to let you know that IMO had the benefit some 15 years ago to convey a meeting of all UN agencies on the relevance of talking about flags of convenience or flags of non-compliance, and this is why really I congratulate for you to use the two terminologies and the speaker before you. It was shown that more and more this issue is of non-compliance, depending on, independently from the level of development of countries, some can be of non-compliance, and this is the focus we try to put, at least at IMO, regarding our members. Thank you.
I don't really know if I have to say anything to that, but thank you so much for highlighting it. And I could say that one of the reasons why it's a problem is, of course, is that a lot of the times the countries that actually flag these vessels do not have the wherewithal to monitor or follow through, which is why vessels, especially those that are criminal-minded, are actually targeting certain countries or specific countries. But hopefully IMO is doing more to support and also support countries to be able to close the loopholes, because the reality is they need the money, which is clearly why they are continuing to do these things, despite the potential implication it might have on the resources in their waters and adjacent waters. So thank you.
Thank you, Ife. Thank you very much again for a wonderful presentation. I just have a small question. I mean, basically your opinion on something. In Indonesia, about 5-7 years ago, there have been a clear campaign organized by the Indonesian government and with the support of the Navy. And the purpose was to blow up many ships. It was a clear destruction of capital, which looked at it was a very big deterrence for infringement. And also it was a reduction by default of the fishing efforts. What do you think about that? And do you think, is it applicable to some countries in Africa? And I'm thinking here also to the Nigerian person, because we're talking about same size country, same capacity, I would say, in terms of the Navy capacity. Do you think it's something that can be replicable in West Africa and in your country in particular?
Thank you so much for the question. There are actually people that are of the mind that we need to replicate such things. And if you look at some of the examples of how the law enforcement or the military are addressing threats like illegal oil bunkering, wherein they destroy the vessel at sea, it means that obviously they are willing to go that far. The problem, however, is the environmental implication, at least from my perspective, given that the environment is already, degenerated. You're worsening it by burning those vessels at sea. And also given the limited capacity, when I say capacity in this sense of countries on the continent to produce or exploit the resources themselves, I'd rather they confiscate the vessel and then use it, the state takes over it and then use it to exploit fisheries themselves rather than destroying it at sea. It's still going to send the same message. You're going to lose your vessel if we catch you engaging in any form of illegal activity in our water, rather than destroying it, which would further undermine the health of the environment. But there are people that think that what happened in Indonesia should be replicated. But there's a question of environmental sustainability, and I can't endorse that. So, thanks.
One from, I think, if you just introduce yourself, because you're new.
Hi, Efe. Charlie at Global Fishing Watch. Thank you. Really interesting talk. I was really interested in also your little, sort of side case study in Sao Tome and Principe, looking at the safeguarding of the fishers' rights, which aren't really working. And a lot of the focus on monitoring the fisheries are at the industrial level, for obvious reasons. And I was wondering if in your feeling there's a gap in the monitoring of the small scale fishers in terms of understanding and then informing those safeguardings to the rights to the access to the fisheries for them. And if that focus is brought a little bit to them, you better understand their needs and what needs to be done. And if that's something that you have an opinion on.
Thank you so much for that. There is a focus on them, but for all the wrong reasons. So there's a focus on industrial vessels operating in the pirate-prone areas just because of piracy, just because a lot of pirates operate with the kind of vessels that they use. So it more or less becomes a case of criminalizing any artisanal vessel that goes outside the legal limits, which is why going up to 50 nautical miles is a problem for them, actually puts them at risk, people being shot at because, oh gosh, potentially these are pirates, right? And an announcement being made to be at alert because a canoe have been seen with 4 men in it. And so this is the kind of attention, but never really around their safety, never really around, safeguarding their livelihoods. A light have not necessarily been shined, at least to the best of my knowledge, at least based on the conversation I've had with people. Because if it has been, then there are NGOs that are already working in the area, in the case of Sao Tome and Principe, and they have talked about how they are sharing compass and where in different communities or island, it is helping fishers. You must go further to be able to catch enough fish. We accept that. And given that this is happening, then this is what you need for your safety. And for them, it is working. And so I guess the case of not necessarily government buy-in, because the government don't have the money. So the international community or international NGOs stepping in to support the work of such NGOs to provide compass, because the reality is they have to go further at sea to catch enough fish to make ends meet. And then from also perspective of law enforcement, wherein the proximity of artisanal fishers is making them the target in cases where at the international or global level, this need for sustainability is a problem, is that we therefore see in a country like Ghana, where we're talking about, premise fuel, for example, for artisanal fishers is contributing to overexploitation by artisanal fishers, or artisanal fishers are not respecting the closed season or fishing ban, for instance, when at the same time industrial fishers or industrial vessels are able to do whatever at sea out of sight, you see, as they are operating within the exclusive economic zone, and because you're not actually there to see what they are doing, and even with information on some of the illegal activities like light fishing and doing other things, they have not necessarily been able to do enough, either because of the fact that unfortunately some of the government officials are apparently linked to the fishing vessels, which perhaps might be something contributing to reduced action despite the so many evidence, because I'm sure some people would wonder, I mean, you've been writing a lot has been written about Ghana as a case study, so why is nothing changing? The EU gave them a yellow card 2013 and rescinded it and now had to give them another one. So what exactly can be done differently? And then in other countries as well, we see artisan, or should I say effort to improve fisheries sustainability being done by targeting the artisanal sector, when in fact the problem is the industrial. I say this because whilst I understand that there's a need to improve fishery governance in general, if you rob an artisanal fisher, for instance, of their source of livelihood, you affect the chain, right? And unless you're able to provide an alternative, you're basically providing an opportunity where these people become prey in the hands of criminal networks who are actually trying to take advantage of the ungoverned spaces at the sea, of which the artisanal sector, artisanal fishers have that knowledge. And so you're basically making them available for criminals because you're not providing an alternative for them. And this is one of the, I think, single most important reason why sustaining fisheries livelihood is the most important topic, so long as I'm concerned, for the African continent at least, because of the potential implication of not getting it right for the peace and security of a continent. I hope I've rambled on, but I hope I have answered your question. Thanks.
I just had a question. I don't know if there's time, but you had the explained before some of the European vessels that were fishing, and then they went and they changed flag, they came back to fish, right? Mm-hmm. And then you said there was the fining of European vessels in some countries. What's the difference in the fining of vessels that are under the flag of a EU member state and any kind of fine for a vessel that now is owned but put under another flag? How does that work?
So thank you so much. And I think that's where the problem lies, because the examples I shared with the fines is not restricted to vessels that might be implicated for any sort of infringement in the EU or in third countries. This is the general example, and this is based on a report by the EU, actually, a European body. The link is there if you want to read further. And so the problem, however, in relation to flag of convenience is, at least to the best of my knowledge and the research that I've read, there's no fine, because it's not their flag, it's not their responsibility, it's the responsibility of the flag state, right? And so there was a discussion, there was actually a time where there was a discussion around what can the EU do to ensure that vessels implicated for EU fishing elsewhere are either held to account, either through losing their subsidies. And it was voted against, or should I say voted down by MEPs, and that did not go through. It was discussed to sort of ensure further penalties. And although I did not talk about this because I talked about it last year, and I'm currently doing a research that made me think even more critically about something that happened last year. So a couple of years ago, some NGOs wrote to DG Mare, the department or unit that is responsible for fishing in the EU, to tell them about some Italian vessels that's been implicated for illegal fishing in the inshore areas of Sierra Leone. And they took it to their lawyers, and their lawyers wrote back a year or two later saying that it was difficult to show or to see whether any encroachment is happening. By this, I mean whether those vessels were actually engaging in any illegal activity by fishing in areas reserved for industrial trawlers because of the lack of clear delineation of the oceans, right? And at the time, my argument was, oh gosh, how can you draw a wall? How can you demarcate the ocean clearly? Because now they're providing precedent for other vessels from other nations that might be implicated for doing the same thing, to say, oh, lack of clarity of delineation makes it difficult for you to say that we actually fished illegally. But with the research I'm doing now, I got to realize, hang on a minute, this is the same country that have maritime boundary dispute with Guinea. And so with using that pronouncement, you're the lawyer, you might know the technical things, but this is me interpreting it. By saying that, basically they're saying, hang on a minute, how can you claim this water when there's actually another country claiming it? This is now my interpretation with further research. So basically to say that a lot of it, and this is why my recommendation on what needs to be done differently requires cooperation and collaboration between states. Because if the EU on their part, and I talked about their capacity, the laws they have, the policies they have, if they are not doing their bit to at least support countries with limitations to do something differently to improve their own, then maybe that's where the problem lies. Because the reality is, the countries on the continent on their own, without support by other countries that might be implicated for engaging in IU fishing, would never be able to do this by themselves. There is a need for global cooperation, and this is why we have laws like the PSMA or things for commitments for countries to sign up to allow for a global collaboration. And I feel, based on the evidence of how these things play out, how vessels are able to take advantage of countries with limited capacity to then break their laws, we need the countries with the capacity to work hand in hand so that when their vessels or companies linked to them have been implicated, they will act on it. I feel that will send a stronger message. If you risk losing your subsidy from Spain, for instance, you would never do it again, coming to Sierra Leone or Senegal and not respecting the regulation around the law. If you are likely to lose your subsidy, you're not going to take advantage of flag of convenience or flag of non-compliance to be able to continue to plunder the oceans. That's what I feel. And unless that collaboration is there, side, from the EU, Asia, Latin America, the global community working together, I feel again we will have Catfish 50, and it's sad to say that.
Okay, thank you very much, Ife. I think maritime boundary disputes could be a very interesting topic for future catfish meetings. I think we actually need to break now. I have one last comment from Medina. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Merci, Ife, for this brilliant presentation. I just want to add a comment. Thank you for feeding us this morning about data. Data are scarce. And I think it's the main challenge for African countries to go to collect data, even for the formal and necessary information about vessels, about registry. It's clear that we have this issue in West Africa, probably because we do not have sometimes resources to go and find the information. Sometimes you are employing a lot of people to have the data, but they are not well paid. They are not going. They are not trying to have the information. So getting the data is really essential for us. And what I want to add it also, the gender point you mentioned is essential because we know the role of women in the fisheries sectors. Even they are in a less stable situation and less wages, they are doing their best to feed the families and to be very important in the value chain, even it is in the last and the final part of the value fisheries chain. Cooperation is the key. You're totally right. And collaboration, interagency collaboration. If you don't have the interagency cooperation in a nation, we will lose the combat against IU fishing. And yes, I was just laughing when I have seen the absence, the absence of vessels and the Chinese one that you've mentioned, going to flag and trying to reflag themselves, and they are IU fishing engaged in one country. You mentioned one country, but they came in Senegal and make the same infringements. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for the comments. I think one thing I'd like to say is that the continent, and should I say at least the region that I research so well, Western Central Africa, they are willing to, do something radically different for the interest of their people, because they know that it cannot be business as usual, but they cannot do it alone. Hence, there's a need for global cooperation, for the global community to also call their vessels, their companies, their countries to order, which is why the subsidy issue you talked about is very important, which is why it could be the first necessary step towards actually putting an end to the plunder. Thank you again, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.